or wishful thinking, you might call it, that after Chavez went, there was a chance for reform in Venezuela. Actually, you're suggesting the opposite, that now that Hugo Chavez has died, in fact, the movement he's created will be stronger than ever.
I think so. I think in the short term it will be stronger. I think the question comes, and I think the country will get through this period of the next couple of months. The question is what happens in 8-10 months from now. This is a country that is going through a profound economic crisis. The level of violence is off the charts. There are shortages. It's very high, highest inflation in Latin America. So this is a country with very serious problems. So why the support?
Why the popular support?
Because there's a sense that Chavez had tried to do his best, and he connected with people. He communicated the sense he was working on their behalf. A lot of people are still better off than they were before Chavez came to power. Oil was $10 a barrel when he came to office. It came over 100, even reached $140 a barrel.
And he's used that oil revenue effectively
for social programs that he's had, and they've imported a lot of goods, consumer goods that people have for the first time in their lives. So there have been some modest improvements in people's social conditions, but still they can't get access to basic goods. Inflation is high, oil production has gone down, and the country really just devalued 35% of its currency, and there's a sense that stronger economic measures will come. And so the government has to come together. That's made up of different factions. Right now, Maduro is going to be the successor, apparently, but nobody has the charisma of Chavez to really hold everything together. So it's going to be a very, very severe test for the government to go through these periods. Right now, I think they're going to be in a relatively strong position, but how long that will last is anybody's guess.
Was it really Chavez's personality then that held his movement together? You're suggesting that Maduro doesn't have his charisma. He is the heir apparent, and in a sense there is a fairly seamless transition process that can now take place in Caracas. But in the medium term, in the longer term, can he hold it together?
I think that's going to be the big question. He doesn't have his personality. Nobody has his personality. He's a larger-than-life figure. And the resources are going to be a problem. They don't have the money. He really spent a lot. The fiscal deficit is very, very high. This is a country that is going through a very significant economic challenge. It had to devalue its currency. They'll have to do that probably again, according to most economic experts. So Chavez was there for the good years. He had his personality, and now the government is going to have to hold things together. I think they probably can do it in the short term, especially with a demoralized and fragmented opposition. But again, over the medium term, I think it's going to be put to a very, very critical test.
And of course, for many Venezuelans, particularly those younger voters, effectively all they've ever known is Hugo Chavez.
It's Hugo Chavez, right. That's been their reality. And so that's also, there's a generational phenomenon as well. And so this is going to be a major, major challenge. It's going to be no matter who's going to govern Venezuela, it's going to be very difficult. This is the most polarized country in Latin America. There's a lot of distrust on both sides. Chavez was a polarizing figure, a confrontational figure, an aggressive personality. He rallied his base, but he also created an opposition that was that was very, very hard line. And so we're going to see where the moderation can come with the Maduro government. Hopefully moderation will come on the opposition side, and there'll begin to be some talking together, channels of communication. I think that's really the best scenario for Venezuela right now.
Michael, describe, you keep talking to me about a larger-than-life figure, and if you suggested many Venezuelans almost see him as a father figure for the country. Describe for us a little bit Chavez the man. What was it that made him such a big figure in Venezuelan politics?
Well, Chavez was really, he was actually here in Washington when he first came in 1999. He came and spoke at my organization, the Inter-American Dialogue. I had a chance to meet him. He's enormously charming, charismatic. He asks about you. He makes you feel like you're very important. And he did that. You see him in action with everybody. I've seen him in Venezuela. I've seen him in Latin America. And he has a real charm. And there's a seductive side of Chavez, and he creates the sense that he could do anything, that people can dream. And so he engenders this kind of hope and high expectations. And when he came in, there were very high expectations. So that's his style. He works very, very hard. He really is a great communicator. He can talk for hours. And so that was really his skill. And he connected with people in a sentimental, emotional way. And he also really began to pay for social programs, which the traditional elites had ignored in the period before his rule. And so people felt, well, here's somebody who cares about me, takes me seriously, even though the programs turned out to be inefficient, the government was incompetent and inept, which I think has created the problems that we're seeing today. but at least he tried, and his motivation was good, his intentions were good. The problem was it didn't work because he made all the decisions. This was somebody that concentrated power over the period of his rule. There were no effective checks or constraints on his authority. The Congress was in his control, the judiciary was in his control, the Electoral Council was in control. He controlled the oil company, he controlled the armed forces. So all of the main pillars in the society were under his control. And in this day and age, it's very hard to have an effective economy when only one person is making the decision.
When you met him back here in Washington before he became president of Venezuela, how clear was it to you that this was somebody who was going to lead the politics of the country in this kind of dictatorial fashion?
Well, I think a lot of people were surprised.
Or did something change during the course of his presidency?
I think he was an evolving phenomenon. This was not, he was more moderate. He clearly was somebody with a great capacity to communicate. Everybody felt that here in Washington when he spoke. He was very, very effective. But the fact that he came here, the fact that he spoke to an audience in Washington, he clearly wanted change. He was intent on change. But he became much more radicalized over the years. That's for a variety of reasons, some of which the United States didn't help very much. The opposition made a lot of mistakes. He became much more sort of hardline, much more militant. So I think many people were surprised that he's more belligerent in his rhetoric than he was when 1999. If you look at the tapes in the last couple of years before he became ill, and in 1999, you see a tremendous contrast, a more conciliatory Chávez back then, a much more hardline.
So what was it that changed him? What was it that made him this antagonistic figure, both with the opposition, of course, with his own country, which routinely, during the course of elections, accused him of suppression of democracy, of not allowing them to run their campaigns, of not allowing them to express their opinions, have their voice in Venezuelan politics, but also with here in Washington. And the relations between Venezuela and Chávez and Washington became extremely bitter over the course of the last few years.
They were very bitter, especially during the Bush years. There was a coup against Chávez in April of 2002. The White House celebrated that coup, didn't disguise its delight. Of course, Chávez, that completely confirmed to Chávez that the United States was out to get him. And of course, that reinforced and fed his paranoia. Also, the opposition had general strikes, had other actions that were not within the spirit of democracy. And that made Chávez much more less trustful, less willing to reach out. And he had his supporters, and so he could win elections. And he did win elections. He was a legitimate president of Venezuela. However, whatever you think about his rule, he was elected by the people. The people wanted him, and they re-elected him several times.
OK, Michael Schifter, do stay with us. We will have more, of course, on this breaking news that Venezuela's President Hugo Chávez has died at the age of 58. Mr. Chávez, who's been in office for 14 years, is believed to have had cancer in his pelvic area, but his exact illness was never disclosed. Most recently, he had been suffering from a severe respiratory infection, and he hadn't been seen or heard from in public for almost 3 months. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins has this assessment of Hugo Chávez's life.
Hugo Chávez saw himself as a revolutionary leader. He was a hero to many of Venezuela's poorest people, but a villain to opposition parties. They hated the friends he kept and the abuses of power they accused him of. This is how Hugo Chávez originally burst onto the world stage. In 1992, as an army colonel, he led a military coup, trying and failing to grab power after decades of more or less corrupt rule in Venezuela. Hugo Chávez was released after 2 years in jail, and the young army officer built his popularity by denouncing the rottenness he wanted to replace.
With these corrupt people, you have to take everything they've stolen away from them and put them in prison, not under house arrest. Put them in a cell and turn them into a public disgrace. That's necessary for Venezuela's moral recovery.
And the soldier transformed himself into radical politician. Finally elected president in 1998, Hugo Chávez transformed Venezuela's politics and presidential dress. Supporters were ecstatic as key industries were steadily nationalized, including oil, source of the country's wealth. President Chávez used the money largely to fund massive health and welfare programs. But many oil workers were dismayed, their bosses sacked, production steadily falling. In 2002, the whole country was embroiled in a general strike, and Chávez was briefly pushed from office. But just 2 days later, After his supporters, mainly the poor, took to the streets, President Chávez was back in the palace. The president's very deliberate radicalism and his choice of friends made him enemies at home and around the world. His reliance on Cuba's Fidel Castro appalled those on the right. Alliance with Iran's President Ahmadinejad inflamed Washington. Using the UN stage to insult President George W. Bush divided the world.
Yesterday, the devil came here. Right here. Right here. And it smells of sulfur still today.
And in Venezuela itself, Hugo Chávez's unique style divided the country. As part of his regular TV show, Allo Presidente, he paraded his socialism, something he stressed talking to the BBC in 2010.
Is it possible to have genuine democracy and genuine respect for the rule of law within your socialism?
The only way to save the world is through socialism, but a socialism that exists within a democracy. There's no dictatorship here. I was elected 3 times, and when the rich threw me out in a coup, the people brought me back to power.
But Hugo Chávez also presided over Venezuela's slide into recession, despite the country's great oil wealth and despite soaring growth in the rest of South America. Paying huge subsidies to provide imported food at low prices for the poor couldn't be sustained, and uncontrolled violent crime marked another failure. Support for opposition parties had grown before Hugo Chávez fell ill. Flown to Cuba for cancer surgery, he was visited by his political hero, Fidel Castro. Despite his illness, the president was re-elected to a 6-year term in October 2012, but he was unable to attend his own inauguration in January. In spite of opposition protests, Venezuela's Supreme Court approved an indefinite delay. So how will Hugo Chávez be remembered? As a true friend of the poor or a radical turned autocrat? His rule in Venezuela polarized the nation between those who condemned Hugo Chávez as a wrecker and those who hailed him as a rescuer.
James Robbins reporting there, and just a quick reminder of our main news and our breaking news coming out of Venezuela. Of course, we are having special programming on Hugo Chávez, who has died at the age of 58. He was president of Venezuela for 14 years, a controversial figure, a polarizing figure, both inside his own country and, of course, with relations here with Washington as well. But we have had the news now. His vice president, Maduro, has announced that Hugo Chávez died at 4:25 local time. That is about 45 minutes ago. I'm joined here in the studio by Michael Schiff. Thank you very much for staying with me, Michael. This, we saw there in that report, you know, this is somebody who professed that democracy was possible in his country, that he was acting in the best interests of Venezuela. And as you were saying earlier on, there is a large segment of the Venezuelan population that is very sad today at the passing of Hugo Chávez. This is not a North Korea situation where we get people bussed in to cheer for the president, but not actually necessarily believing it. There are Venezuelans who loved their president, who loved Hugo Chávez.
Yeah. Well, you have to look at the context. He came at a time in 1999. This is a country that experienced 2 lost decades, elites that were corrupt, mismanaged, didn't care about the poor. The poor had increased, and here comes a guy who says, I'm going to work for you. We're going to have social programs. He put emphasis on the social agenda. How effective he was in that, I think, is another question, but there's no question that he put more emphasis on that he cared about that, and people felt that. He went to certain areas and certain poor areas, barrios of major cities that other presidents hadn't been to. He connected with people. He said, you know, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get you that. That was the kind of hands-on micromanager leader that he was. And that meant a lot in a country where before the leaders had seemed very distant, very remote, and seemed to be in their own world and very separate from the vast majority of the people. And that counts for a lot in politics. It shouldn't be underestimated. At the end, I think the tragedy that it really was a great opportunity because of the money he had, the leadership qualities he had, but he didn't really deliver a sustainable model. Nobody in Latin America sees Venezuela as the model, as a society that was transformed in a way that's sustainable, where people have jobs, and where this is a country that is really growing and that's distributing its resources. He was a guy who had a lot of money, and he gave it out to people who didn't have it before, and so they are very grateful, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that there's that much mourning and that much sadness in Venezuela.
Michael, I'm always reminded by Latin American experts such as yourself that Latin America is a continent of distinct countries, and each one is separate. But if you look at Evo Morales, if you look at Lula in Brazil, if you look at Hugo Chávez, they're all different leaders and with different political systems. But did Chávez represent a shift to the left in the continent?
I think he did. I think he did in the way, but not the left, the kind of left that was ultimately favored and prevailed. It was really the Lula left, the Brazilian left, that was more moderate, more pragmatic. After all, they have relations with the United States. There's more of a give and take of democratic politics. There is a judiciary that works. It's not under the control of one single person. That was the type that Chávez developed, which I think has been rejected by most countries in Latin America. But what I think they all share is a sense of greater attention to the social injustice that is pervasive in the region. What Chávez did was put his finger on a legitimate grievance that poor people have, not just in Venezuela, but in many countries. And he had money to back it up.
Because he had the oil.
Because he had the oil. And so you go to many places in Latin America, there's just enormous gratitude to Chávez, and Maduro sees this when he traveled as foreign minister, because they know that Chávez helped them out. He gives money he gives home heating oil to low-income people in the United States, in New York and Massachusetts, and works with Joseph Kennedy and the like. So even here, he's looking for a constituency. He was a guy,
he was the ultimate
even the
politician.
wealthiest country in the world, he was the ultimate politician.
If Hugo Chávez had not had oil, and oil prices had not risen over the last few years as they had done, would he have been president for 14 years?
I think it's very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely. He had his charisma, but he needed the resources as well. The charisma took him a long way, but only so far. And I think he would not have been able to really sustain himself in power. He was able to deliver and improve the lot of a lot of people. So I think oil was very critical. On the other hand, oil wasn't the only thing. He needed to have that leadership style, that connection, that passion for the kind of revolution that he saw, and he saw himself as a real historic figure.
And we do hope to be able to get to Caracas in just a moment. We have our correspondent there as soon as the line is ready. Of course, it's always tricky getting through to Venezuela. It's a country that has enormous wealth, but the communications are not always what they could be. And it's an indication of the problems that the country has.
Yeah, no, they're really serious problems. And here's a country that has lots of things going for it, but has shortages of basic goods, of milk, of sugar. In the supermarkets, people can't get that. There's infrastructure that's decaying. They're very, very serious problems. And this is really a problem of governance, of incompetent, incapable government, which is a product of one person calling all the shots for 14 years. This is what happens.
Okay, now that Hugo Chávez is dead, now that he has gone, what happens next, Michael?
Well, I think according to the Constitution, there'll be elections. I think the elections will probably go forward.
We just had elections, of course.
Right, they had elections, and now they'll have elections again, and Maduro would be the candidate, and the opposition will have to come up with its candidate. And I think the government has clearly the upper hand in this contest. I think that's what's going to happen. In the short term, I think things will hold together, but it's going to get complicated.
And Maduro will get the vote because Chávez anointed him?
Chávez anointed him because people don't have confidence in the opposition, and because him and the other Chavista leaders have come together and will say they'll carry forward the revolution. And I think the Chávez has the name will really give a lot of weight and a lot of strength to this movement and to the regime.
Michael, what happens now with relations with Washington?
I think there's going to be some communication, perhaps even explore the idea of having ambassadors in both capitals, in Caracas and Washington, which hasn't been the case for a while. But I want, Maduro is somebody who is very close to Cuba. He's very ideologically on the left. Rhetorically, he's going to be very hardline, as we saw today in his speech. But I think privately and behind the scenes, you may see some communication begin to open up, which I think would be positive.
Okay, Michael Schifter, thank you very much for all of that. That was
Thank
a
you.
fantastic explanation there of Hugo Chávez's time in office. A reminder, of course, we have this breaking news out of Venezuela. Hugo Chávez is dead. We can go now to Caracas. The BBC's Irene Caselli is there. She joins us. Irene, what more do we know about how this announcement was made and what happened during the course of today?
Well, all we know so far is that Maduro's announced that the president died about an hour, just over an hour ago. This is all we know. We know that during the day, the government, different government officials met up. Vice President Maduro had a very long televised address to the nation. This was over 2.5 hours ago, but during that time, he was still saying that President Hugo Chávez's health was stable. So this is all we know so far.
The signs during the course of the day, Irene, had been that his health had deteriorated quite significantly. And then we had this curious comment from Vice President Maduro earlier in the day that this was some sort of an attack or plot against Venezuela and the expulsion of American diplomats. What more can you tell us about that?
That's right. Last night we had a first announcement of the deterioration of the health of Mr. Chávez. Then later we heard today during the day that Vice President Maduro was blaming the foreigners for giving bad energy to the president and for inoculating this cancer. But this is something that we've heard before. President Chávez himself had said this in the past, saying that not only him but also other Latin American leaders have been victims of the evil powers of the West, as he called them.
Irene, what can you tell us about the reaction? We're seeing now live pictures from Caracas coming into us, people holding posters there of Hugo Chávez in the center of town. What more can you tell us on the reaction in Caracas?
I think the reactions will be very different. Just in the area where I am, there's a lot of anti-Chavez feeling, and I've been hearing cars making noises. There were a few fireworks as a sign of celebration, and at the same time, for many, this will be a huge moment of mourning. Already this morning, there were people lining up in a chapel in the hospital where the government said the president was still there, and people were crying, people were praying for the health of the president.
It seems that in Venezuela, as we were hearing from our guest here in the studio earlier, that he really was a polarizing figure, and if you've suggested people will either be glad that he's died or they will be very sad that he's died, but there isn't very much in between.
That's right. The country is very polarized about Hugo Chávez. There were people that always thought that he was a dictator, and at the same time, for a lot of people, he changed their lives. Just this morning, I was talking to a woman who had tears in her eyes as she was praying for the president, and she said that her life had changed, that she felt now part of a big Venezuelan family. I mean, what's for sure is that despite the comparisons to him being a dictator or a savior, what's for sure is that Hugo Chávez is going to be remembered as a changing figure here in the country.
And we can see still those pictures that have just come into us from Caracas, people holding the posters of Hugo Chávez. He, of course, had just recently won a re-election in the country. We can see there the officials. We know that this announcement was made, Irene, by the Vice President, Mr. Maduro. What do people make of him in Caracas, Mr. Maduro?
Maduro wasn't the most popular of people, but then Mr. Chávez appointed him as his preferred successor. In polls back around October, he only received about 4%. This was during the election, while pollsters were trying to figure out whether there were other candidates besides Mr. Chávez in Mr. Chávez's party. Mr. Maduro wasn't even the most popular one. But then just before Mr. Chávez left for cancer surgery, for his latest cancer surgery in Cuba, Mr. Chávez appointed him, and that seemed to give him enough popularity. For now, people think that Mr. Chavez picked him for a reason, and today's press conference was a sign from Mr. Maduro, was an attempt to show that he's capable of holding a unity within the country. There had been loads of rumors about infighting between Chavez's party without the presence of Mr. Chavez. So today's press conference was definitely a sign of trying to silence those rumors and trying to show to people, to Venezuelans, that he is the new leader. He can be the new leader. He can hold all those differences together, just like Mr. Chavez did. If he can, we shall see if that's possible.
And Irene, what is the speculation about what happens in Venezuela now? Is the assumption that Mr. Maduro takes over and that he wins the election that will be called?
Well, first of all, elections have to be called. They will be taking place within 30 days. This is what the Constitution says. If Mr. Maduro is seen as Mr. Chavez's successor, which is very likely it will happen at this point, then the likelihood of him being elected is very high. Just in October, Mr. Chavez won over 11 points over the opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles. So far, the opposition hasn't officially announced their candidate yet, but it's very likely Mr. Capriles will be the one to run again.
Okay, Irene Caselli there, joining us from Caracas, Venezuela, with the news, the breaking news that has come into us within the course of the last half hour that Venezuela's President Hugo Chávez has died at the age of 58. Mr. Chávez had been in office for 14 years. He's believed to have had cancer in the pelvic area. The exact cause of his illness was never quite disclosed. Most recently, he'd been suffering, though, from a severe respiratory infection, and he hadn't been seen or heard in public for almost 3 months. During the course of the day, the news had clearly come in from Caracas that his health had taken a severe turn for the worse, and it was announced by the Vice President, Nicolas Maduro, that Hugo Chávez, the president of Venezuela, has died. This is BBC World News America reporting from Washington. I'm Katty Kay. Venezuela's President Hugo Chávez has died at the age of 58. He was suffering from a respiratory infection after cancer surgery. The charismatic leader left for Cuba in December, where he underwent treatment. He was never seen again in public. The news today was met with grief by Mr. Chávez's many supporters after the vice president announced his death on television. Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and also around the globe. Venezuela's President Hugo Chávez has died at the age of 58. His death has just been announced by his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, in an emotional address on Venezuelan television. The military says they will remain loyal to the vice president and to parliament, and they urge the people in Venezuela to remain calm. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Michael Shifter, the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you very much, Michael, for coming in. As we went on air just a few moments ago, we were getting the news out of Venezuela after a turbulent day in Caracas that Hugo Chávez had died.
Yes, well, this has been building for a long time. There have been a lot of rumors and speculation. People were waiting and watching, and it was clear we hadn't been seen or heard from for 3 months. So this is not a surprise. I think the government has been preparing for it. The opposition has been preparing for it. But of course, a lot of the people, Venezuelan people, who have tremendous loyalty to Chávez, were hoping that he'd come back.
Because he was dearly loved by a segment of his population.
Clearly, he had a big following. He was somebody who connected with people in an emotional way, a sentimental way. And of course, they also got better during his rule. Oil prices went from $10 to over $100, and Chávez was giving out a lot of things, and it was really made it clear that he was really, what he cared about were the poor and the marginalized of Venezuela.
Michael, here in Washington and within his own country, he was a very polarizing figure. You met him before he became president. What was he like as a man?
Very charming, very seductive in a lot of ways. He connected with you. He made you feel like you were important. He was a great communicator. But obviously, he's somebody who also had a tremendous appetite for power and ended up concentrating all the power in his own hands. And there was no constraint on his authority, on his power. And of course, I think that led to real problems in the country. But he was somebody who really thought he knew best for everybody and expressed the general will of the Venezuelan people. And that left little room for others who wanted to challenge him. And he wasn't very good at letting people challenge him.
During the course of his illness, there's been speculation, or perhaps we should say wishful thinking here in Washington, that the end of Hugo Chávez would mean the end of the Chávez regime, of the system of government in Venezuela. Does it? No, I think the Chávez regime becomes strengthened in the short term. I think his death gives it a lot of support. I think the Chávez figures, the people who have been loyal to him for so long, will come together. They need to come together. They have to keep this thing going. A lot of people have benefited from 14 years of Chávez rule. The question is really what happens over the medium and longer term when the economic crisis deepens, the security crisis is bad, people don't have access to goods, inflation goes up higher. Then I think Chávez's charisma and sort of the transfer effect from Chávez to Maduro may become a little weaker, and then I think the problems start. Does it give a chance to the opposition to mount some sort of effective campaign now against Maduro?
I think they do, but they have to be patient. It's not going to happen right away. The elections will have to be called within 30 days, according to the Constitution. They're going to have a very, very tough time winning these elections. But then I think they really have to build for the future. And they've been doing this for 14 years, so they're a little bit frustrated, which is understandable. But I think their challenge is to try to keep focused on a strategy, come up with new leadership, and really try to challenge this regime to think about the longer term.
And is Maduro an effective successor to Chávez?
Well, he can't match Chávez's charisma. He can't hold everything together. No, I don't think anybody can. There are going to be a lot of people that are unhappy with him. But I think given the options within Chávez, he's probably the best choice. He's somebody who was a union leader. He was a president of the Congress. He was a foreign minister. So he's had some background, and he doesn't compare to Chávez, but he's probably makes more sense than any of the other options. Okay, Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue, thank you very much for being with us here on the studio on this important day in Venezuelan